Hi guys, welcome back, and today we are going to be reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. And if you have not read this book, it is a very famous book about Harry Potter and his life. It is a fantasy book, but it is his life at wizarding school, and he gets to these they really don't believe in this stuff, but he is a part of this stuff, so he gets transferred to Hogwarts so he could do it. So let's go in and read. They have 7 books. He's transferred, so you can see. These are all the books he has. This one is in the Sorcerer's Stone, of course, but they also have, these are all by J.K. Rowling too. They also have Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, was whenever he was his second year at Hogwarts. It just goes down. Okay, and then we have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Illustrations by Mary Ronry. Okay, so today we're going to read Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Pivot Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called the Gurnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man, hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley. In their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. Their greatest fear, somebody would discover it. That's our first page, and let's go to the next. They didn't think they could bear if anyone found out about the Potters. Here is where Harry's mom, dad, and Harry come in. The Potters. Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dudley's sister, was Mrs. Dudley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dudley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her wealth and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possibly to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would see if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never ever seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dudley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little take," chuckled Mr. Dursley as he left the house, got into his car, and backed out of Number 4's drive. There was something on the corner of the street that he had noticed, and the first sign of something in particular. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing at the corner of Pivot Drive. But there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back as Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the street. He watched the cat in his mirror and was now reading the sign. It was now reading the sign that said Pivot Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of the town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was possibly some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on. A few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on trails. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping. Okay, next page. Passed in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his leg and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. They made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road and hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary to not disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he had changed his mind, when he put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name, and they were sure there was lots of people called Potter who had a son named Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew was called Harry. Never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at the mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he'd had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks, he found it all a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside that door. Sorry, grunted, as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem upset at all. Almost knocked to the being almost knocked to the ground on the contrary. His face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that he made casually state, Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating. Happy, happy day. And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted at the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that being called a muggle, whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home because he was imagining things which he had never hoped, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning and was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eye. Shoo! Said Mr. Dursley loudly. Okay, so I want to go back to right here where it says, Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day. So there's 2 words I want to talk about here. The you-know-who and muggles. So let's talk about muggles. Muggles are people who don't believe in witches and magic and spells. And then, about that stuff. And then, you-know-who is a character in the story named Baltimore. But in Harry Potter, they do not speak of Baltimore's name. Okay. Next page. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look, which was normal. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was so determined to not mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room in time to catch the last report on evening news. And then this is what the report said. And finally, birdwatchers everywhere have reported that the national owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight, there has been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls had suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster had suddenly changed. Oh no, newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now over to Jim McGurfin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me instead of the rain that I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating Bonfire Night early. That's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dudley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying in daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying two cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously, said nervously, Petunia, dear? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked as shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there was a lot of funny people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through her lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose. Suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty, common name if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered into the front garden. The cat was still there, staring down Pivot Drive as though it was waiting for something. Is he imagining things? Could it all have to do with the Potters? On reading. All have to do with the Potters if it did. If it got out that they were related to a pair of, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there's no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up into anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect him. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall side showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue with his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Pivot Drive. It didn't so much quiver when a car door slammed on the street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Pivot Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore will be mentioned a lot in this story, but he is actually one of the main characters not a main character, but he's an important character. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived onto a street where everything from his name to his boots were unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of a cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "Should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street light went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into dark. As 12 times he clicked the putt outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of a cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't have been able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the outputter back into his cloak, sat off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." McGonagall? He turned and smiled at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was rather smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around eyes. She too was wearing a coat, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun, looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she said. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." Okay, so another person. So we have found out about Dudley, Mrs. Dudley, Mr. Dudley, Mrs. Potter, Mr. Potter, Harry, Dumbledore, and Professor McGonagall. "You'd be stiff. You'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "Oh, day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feast parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everybody's celebrating all right," he said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a little more careful, but no. Even Muggles have noticed something going on. It was on their nose." She jerked her head back at the Dursley's dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls shooting stars? Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent? I bet that was Daedalus Dingle. He had so much sense." Another character, Daedalus Dingle. You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People have been downright careless out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, whopping rumors." He threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore. Here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't. So she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the very day you know who seems to disappear at last, the Muggles found out about all us. I suppose he really had gone, Dumbledore. He really has gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "What? A lemon drop?" "They're kind of rather sweet. I'm rather fond of them." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you know who has gone, my dear Professor, Surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I've been trying to persuade people to call him proper name, Voldemort. See? I was going to say, see, Voldemort is you-know-who. Professor McGale flinched. But Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. It gets all confusing when we keep saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Baltimore's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGale, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. Yep. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one who you-know-who. Oh, all right, Baltimore was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Baltimore had powers I never will. Only because you're too, well, able to use them. Lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGale shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know that everyone's saying about he's disappeared and about what finally stopped him." It seemed that Professor McGale had reached a point he was most anxious to discuss, the real reason he had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, he was not going. How many more pages we got, guys? Okay, we have a few more pages. Right here. To believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop. Is that what I said? Wait, no. Was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they're saying? He pressed on. Is it that last night Baltimore turned up in the Godless Hollow and he went to the Potters? The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head at Professor McGale, gasped. Lily and James, I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, she said heavily. Professor McGale's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying that he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how. But they are saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Baltimore nodded gumly. Wait, is that what I said? Nodded gumly. It's true? Fluttered. It's it's true, flattered Professor McGale. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy. It's just astronomy of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGale pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket. He exclaimed it was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving on the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late, I suppose. Look, another character, Hagrid. Hagrid's late. I suppose it was, he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGale. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here? Of all places, I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They are the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGale, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter, repeated Professor McGale faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all of this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember? Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it in? Professor McGale opened her mouth, changed her mind. Okay. And swallowed. Then she said, yes, you're right, of course, but how is the boy getting here? Dumbledore, she eyed his cloak suddenly as though he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I wouldn't trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not going to say his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGale grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to. What was that? Rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew suddenly louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of headlight. It swelled to the roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell at the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. His long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face, and he had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like a baby dolphin's in his vast, muscular arms. He was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved at last. And where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully up the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. He has got Harry. No problems were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the Muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside was visible was a baby boy fast asleep under a tuft of jet black hair. Jet black hair over his forehead. He could see seriously shaped cut like a lightning bolt. Said there were, whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. He'll have that scar forever. He couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself on my left knee and the perfect map of London Underground. Well, I give him here, Hagrid. I'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned toward the Dursleys' house. How could I say goodbye to him, sir? Said Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a scratchy, whiskery kiss. And suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. Shh! Hissed Professor McGonagall. You'll wake up the Muggles. Sorry, sobbed Hagrid as he took taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Billy and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found. Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid. Gringling on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry. No. Yeah. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep and took a letter out of his coat, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked fiercely at the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes. Seemed to have gone out. Well, said Dumbledore finally. That's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go enjoy celebrations. Yeah, said Hagrid in a muffled voice. I'd best get this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir. weeping his, wiping his streaming eyes on his jagged sleeve. Hagrid swung himself onto a motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, rose into the air and off into the night. I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGale, said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGale blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out a small powder. He clicked it once, and 12 bulbs of light sped back into the street, back into their street lamps. Back into the street lamps, so Pip-Greg glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets at the step of number 4. Good luck, Harry, he murmured, and he turned his heel, and with a swish of cloak, he was gone. Breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Pivot Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sink, and the very last place you would expect the strangest thing to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside the blankets without waking up. One small hand closed the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, and not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken up in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dudley's scream as she opened the front door, put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment he was meeting in the secret of the country all over the world were holding their glasses and saying the hushed voices, to Harry Potter, the boy who lived. Well, that is the first chapter for you guys. I recommend you guys reading this story on your own, and I will see you guys next time for the next chapter. Bye!